May 14th, 1998, Palm Springs, California, Frank Sinatra. The scarred baby from Hoboken who was left for dead on a kitchen table, the boy who slept on floors between roadhouse gigs that paid nothing, the young man who started a riot at the Paramount Theater and made combat soldiers cry in the North African desert, the king of Las Vegas who produced a presidential inauguration and destroyed a helipad with a sledgehammer, the man who lost everything twice and built it back both times, the man who carried one woman's love in his chest like a permanent wound for 50 years. Frank Sinatra died in his home at 82 years old. His last words spoken to his wife Barbara were 3 words: "I'm losing." He was not wrong, but he was also not finished. Because what Frank Sinatra left behind was not the kind of thing that a man's death can take with it. The voice was going to outlast the man. The songs were going to outlast the century, and in a cemetery in Cathedral City, California, the thing they found in his pocket when they buried him would tell the complete story of his life in a single object, a ring that had belonged to Ava Gardner. He had carried it to the end. He was going to be buried with it. This is episode 7, the final chapter, the last tours, the last performance, the last years, the death of the woman he never stopped loving, the collapse on stage at 78 that he survived, and the one at 82 that he did not, and the legacy of a man who did it his way every single day for 82 years and left behind enough to fill the next 100. 1973, 2 years after the farewell concert at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, 2 years of Palm Springs quiet and hunting trips and the particular restlessness of a man who has tried retirement and found it fundamentally incompatible with his nature. Frank Sinatra released an album called Old Blue Eyes Is Back. The title was not modest. It was not apologetic. It was not the careful, tentative announcement of a man testing whether the world still wanted him. It was a statement of fact delivered with the confidence of someone who has decided that the retirement was an experiment and the experiment is over and the results have been assessed and the conclusion is that Frank Sinatra does not retire. The album was arranged by Gordon Jenkins and Don Costa, collaborators who understood that the voice they were working with in 1973 required different treatment than the voice Nelson Riddle had arranged for in the 1950s. The upper register was more limited now. The breath control was still extraordinary. Decades of disciplined training do not simply dissolve, but the instrument had aged in ways that honest arranging needed to acknowledge rather than paper over. What it had gained was something the younger voice had not possessed and could not have possessed. The voice of 1973 carried in it the full weight of everything that had happened between the Paramount and the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion. Every recording session and every combat performance and every year of the Ava wound and every night at the Sands and the paper bags of ransom money and the Kennedy betrayal and My Way recorded in a single session on New Year's Eve. All of it was in the voice, not as a performance of experience, but as the simple, undecorated fact of it. The album was received warmly. More importantly, it announced to the entertainment world that Frank Sinatra was not finished, and that anyone who had adjusted their plans to account for his absence needed to readjust them. He went on tour. Most men of his age and achievement would have accepted the standing ovation and walked off gracefully. Frank Sinatra was not most men. He performed until his body made it physically impossible, and even then, he tried. The 1970s and 1980s became the final great era of Frank Sinatra's live performances, a sustained, decades-long farewell that he never officially announced and never fully completed. He toured arenas and casino showrooms and concert halls across America and the world with a consistency that exhausted men a third of his age, and that he appeared to find not exhausting but necessary. The audiences were enormous. The 65-plus generation that had grown up with the voice, that had been the Bobby Soxers at the Paramount, the soldiers in the North African desert, the people who had danced at their weddings to songs from Songs for Young Lovers, came out year after year in the numbers that only genuine love produces. Not nostalgia, though nostalgia was present. Something more fundamental. The recognition that what this man did with a song was irreplaceable and finite, and that the opportunity to be in the same room when he did it was not something to be passed up. He began using a teleprompter on stage in the early 1980s. The memory was becoming unreliable. Lyrics he had sung 10,000 times were occasionally disappearing in the middle of a performance, the familiar words suddenly absent from a mind that had held them effortlessly for decades. The teleprompter was placed discreetly, used without announcement, absorbed into the performance with the same professional adaptability that had always characterized how Sinatra dealt with obstacles. He performed with a hand that trembled. His voice in the final touring years had lost significant range and the high notes that the Capitol Records arrangements had showcased were no longer reliably available, and the lower registers that had always carried the emotional weight of his ballads were rougher now, less controlled at the edges. A lesser artist would have heard the deterioration and retreated from it. Sinatra incorporated it. The roughness became part of the truth of the performance, a voice carrying everything it had been through, honest about the cost of 80 years of living, incapable of the smooth professional surface that would have been less authentic and infinitely less moving. His daughter Tina, who watched her father perform through these final touring years with the complex emotional experience of a daughter who loves completely and understands what she is witnessing, described the performances as simultaneously heartbreaking and transcendent. Heartbreaking because the deterioration was visible and real and could not be stopped. Transcendent because what remained, the phrasing, the connection to the lyric, the specific quality of a man telling the complete truth about what a song means to her, was still something she had never encountered anywhere else. The man refused to leave the stage, because the stage was the only place he had ever been completely himself. He had carried her for 50 years. When she died, something in him that had never healed simply stopped bleeding, and those who knew him said he was never quite the same again. January 25, 1990, London, England. Ava Gardner died in her Kensington flat. She was 67 years old. She had suffered a stroke in 1986 that had left her partially paralyzed on the right side of her body. The woman who had been considered the most beautiful in the world, who had moved through rooms with the physical grace of someone designed for that specific purpose, was in her final years confined largely to her flat, cared for by a small circle of devoted friends and staff. The money Frank Sinatra sent had continued arriving quietly and regularly until the end. He had not seen her in years. The direct contact between them had faded as the decades accumulated, the specific intensity of what they had been to each other belonging to a time that was now very distant. But the obligation he felt, or perhaps not obligation, but simply the irrevocable nature of what she was to him, had expressed itself through those regular transfers for 30 years. When she died, he did not give interviews. He did not make public statements about what Ava Gardner had meant to him or issue carefully worded tributes through his publicist. He went quiet in the particular way that Frank Sinatra went quiet when something was too important for the public language available to him. Those who were close to him in the months after Ava's death described what they saw with consistent language. He aged. Visibly, noticeably, in ways that the previous years had not produced despite the touring schedule and the natural accumulation of his 74 years. He moved more slowly, he spoke less. The specific animation that had always characterized him, the forward-leaning energy of a man who was always about to do something, who was always arriving somewhere rather than leaving, seemed to be absent. He had loved her since 1949. He had lost her formally in 1953. He had carried what they had been. The impossible love, the impossible marriage, the impossible aftermath through every subsequent year of his life, through the Oscar and the Rat Pack and the inaugural gala and the sledgehammer and My Way and the retirement and the return. She had been a constant in his internal life the way that the voice was a constant, something he could not imagine himself without even when it was absent. Now she was gone. The wound that had defined him for 40 years closed in the only way it could, not with healing, which implies recovery, but with finality. The source of the pain was gone. The pain itself would simply have to be absorbed into everything else he carried. He continued performing. The voice began to go. The early 1990s brought Frank Sinatra face to face with the final adversary. The one that ferocity and willpower and professional discipline cannot defeat, that the sledgehammer cannot address, that the voice cannot argue with. The dementia arrived slowly and then more quickly, as it always does. The memories that were the foundation of his life, the specific, detailed memories of performances and recording sessions and friendships and Las Vegas nights and the faces of people he had loved, began to lose their resolution. Not all at once, not dramatically, but with the steady, patient erosion of something that cannot be stopped regardless of how much the person losing it and the people watching refuse to accept what is happening. There were nights in the final touring years, 1993, 1994, when he was lost on stage. Not lost in the professional sense of forgetting a lyric, which the teleprompter could address. Lost in a deeper sense. Uncertain of where he was, of what was expected of him, of the relationship between the man standing at the microphone and the vast crowd before him that was looking at him with an intensity of love that he had received his entire life and was now sometimes unable to fully process. His road manager and the musicians and the production staff who traveled with him in those final touring years surrounded him with a protective web of professional care that allowed the shows to happen, that it got him to the stage and through the performance and back to the hotel with the dignity that was owed to him preserved intact. They did this because they loved him, and because they understood that performing was not something Frank Sinatra did. It was something he was. Taking it from him before the absolute last moment would have been a cruelty that none of them were willing to commit. March 1994, Richmond, Virginia, a concert at the Richmond Coliseum. In the middle of a performance, Frank Sinatra collapsed on stage. He was 78 years old. He was helped off the stage by his team. He was examined, stabilized, declared medically recoverable. And when the doctors had done what doctors do and the immediate crisis had passed, Frank Sinatra did what Frank Sinatra always did. He went back. He finished the tour. At 78 years old, after collapsing on stage in front of thousands of people, he returned to the stage and completed the remaining dates of the tour with the particular, implacable stubbornness of a man who has been told his whole life what he cannot do and has been right his whole life to ignore it. The final public performance came in 1995. Not a concert, not a formal engagement, a golf tournament in Palm Springs. The Sinatras had long been part of the Palm Springs social world, and there was an informal gathering where he sang a few songs for the people assembled. No grand staging, no production, just a man and his voice in a room. Nobody knew it was the last time. He did not know it was the last time. It happened quietly, without ceremony, the way the most important things usually do. In the final years, when the voice was gone and the memories were going, one thing remained. The music was always the last thing to go. And in the silence, he was still conducting. The final years in Palm Springs were spent in the company of his fourth wife, Barbara, who had been with him since 1976 and who provided in those last years the steady, patient presence that the final chapter of his life required. She managed the household, managed his care, managed the interface between the public world that still regarded Frank Sinatra as a living monument and the private reality of a man whose great engine was finally, irreversibly winding down. The dementia continued its patient work. The specific memories, the dates, the names, the detailed biography of an 82-year life became less reliable, less accessible. But those who sat with him in those final years reported something that moved them consistently and that they described with the same words. He hummed. Not specific songs always. Sometimes it was a phrase from something recognizable, a few bars of a melody that had been part of his life for 60 years. Sometimes it was something else entirely, something internal, something that had no name in the public catalog of Frank Sinatra recordings, but that clearly existed somewhere in him that the dementia had not yet reached. He conducted. With his hands, the large, strong hands that had held microphones and Jack Daniels glasses and Ava Gardner and ransom money in paper bags, he conducted invisible orchestras. The hands moved with purpose and precision, following rhythms that only he could hear, directing musicians who existed only in whatever part of his mind still belonged entirely to the music. The music was the last thing to go. May 14th, 1998. Frank Sinatra's heart stopped at his Palm Springs home. He was 82 years old. His wife Barbara was with him. His last words, "I'm losing," were spoken with the directness that had characterized everything he had ever said. No sentimentality, no performance, just the plain truth of what was happening, stated simply, in the way he had always preferred to say things. They prepared him for burial at Desert Memorial Park in Cathedral City, California. They placed a bottle of Jack Daniels in the coffin. He had always been specific about his whiskey, and this final detail was non-negotiable. They placed his cherry-flavored lifesavers. He had carried them constantly, a small sweetness he had maintained as a personal habit through decades of the hardest living imaginable. They placed a dime. He had always carried a dime, from the Hoboken years when a dime was the price of a phone call, and the habit had stayed with him through every subsequent era of his life. Through the millions and the fame and the empire, the dime always in his pocket, and in his jacket pocket placed there before the burial was a ring. Ava Gardner's wedding ring. The ring from their marriage. The marriage that had lasted 2 years formally and 45 years in every way that actually counted. The ring she had worn as his wife. The ring that represented the love he had never resolved, never recovered from, never stopped carrying. He had kept it. Through the marriages that followed, through the decades, through all of it, he had kept it. He was buried with it. The scarred baby from Hoboken, left for dead on a kitchen table in 1915, was buried 82 years later with the ring of the woman he had loved since 1949 in his jacket pocket. He has been gone for more than 25 years. My Way is still playing, at weddings, at funerals, in kitchens late at night. The voice does not age. Frank Sinatra left behind a catalog of recordings that music historians place among the greatest achievements in American popular music. Not greatest for their era, greatest, period. In the wee small hours, Only the Lonely, Songs for Swingers, Where Are You, Come Fly With Me. Albums that demonstrated what the human voice could do when the instrument was extraordinary and the artist was honest, and the arranger understood both. But the recordings are only part of what he left. He left the story. The story of a boy born with scars on his face in a New Jersey tenement who was told his entire life what he could not do and was right his entire life to ignore it, who was called a coward and refused to apologize, who was destroyed at 37 and came back at 38 with an Oscar, who built the most glamorous entertainment empire in American history and helped elect a president and took a sledgehammer to a helipad when that president chose someone else, who loved one woman for 50 years with the specific, permanent, irrevocable completeness of someone who found the one thing that mattered and lost it and never pretended otherwise. My Way plays at funerals across America to this day. Not at celebrity funerals, though it plays there too. At the funerals of truck drivers and teachers and factory workers and farmers, men and women who heard in that song something they recognized as the truest description available of what a life lived on one's own terms actually costs and what it actually means. They heard Frank Sinatra sing I Did It My Way, and they knew, not as a celebrity endorsement but as a personal testimony, that the man singing it was not performing a sentiment. He was reporting a fact. Every choice made without apology. Every consequence accepted without complaint. Every wound carried without demanding that the world acknowledge the carrying. The 65-plus Americans who watched him perform throughout their lives did not love Frank Sinatra because he was perfect. He was not perfect. He was complicated and difficult and sometimes cruel and sometimes magnificent and occasionally wrong about things that mattered and right about things that were unpopular and impossible to be around on his worst days and irreplaceable on every other day. They loved him because he was completely, entirely, unapologetically himself. In every era, in every circumstance, at every point, in a life that contained more reversals and recoveries than most men can imagine, the same man, the Hoboken kid who decided at 17 what he was and spent 65 years proving it, was present in every decade, in every performance, in every song. He did it his way. Frank Sinatra, the voice, the chairman of the board, the king of Las Vegas, born on a cold kitchen table in Hoboken when the doctor had already given up on him, saved by a grandmother who held him under cold water until he screamed. He spent 82 years screaming, not in distress, but in the most productive, most beautiful, most honest form of screaming available to a human being. He stood at microphones in roadhouses and concert halls and military stages in North Africa and casino showrooms in Las Vegas and arenas across the country, and he opened his mouth and he told the truth about longing, about loss, about the 3 a.m. feeling when the room is quiet and the thing you want most is the thing you cannot have, about the specific quality of love that is permanent and irrevocable and does not require the other person's presence to remain completely real, about a life lived at full volume, with full consequences, without apology. The voice that carried all of it, that started in Hoboken and trained in Tommy Dorsey's orchestra and hemorrhaged at the Copa Room and came back deeper at Capitol Records and frayed at the edges in the final touring years and eventually fell silent on May 14, 1998. That voice is still present in every recording, in every note of every album, in every speaker and every pair of headphones and every kitchen late at night where someone puts on In the Wee Small Hours because they need someone to understand what they are carrying. Frank Sinatra is still singing. And somewhere in Desert Memorial Park in Cathedral City, California, the ring in his pocket means what it has always meant. That the greatest love story Frank Sinatra ever lived was not a performance, it was his way. This was Frank Sinatra. This was Legends of America. 7 episodes, 1 voice, 1 life, 1 love that lasted longer than the man who carried it. Subscribe, because the legends never stop.